Thank you, Karim. Our final speaker is Beth Noveck. She's a professor at NYU and the director of the Governance Lab. Beth led President Obama's Open Government Initiative and was a main force behind the Peer-to-Patent project, which is one of my favorite open government initiatives. Beth.
This is. Here's the control. Thank you. Sorry. Mac PC. Thank you. Mac PC dysfunction. All right, it's no fun to follow the guy with the movies. So it was. I can go back to sleep again. Since I'm going to switch from talking about the excitement of things like brands and cars and movies and cool stuff to talking about the dreaded topic of government. But that is my role as the lawyer. So as we know, the challenges we're facing, not in business so much, but in the world of government and governance, around questions not only how to find the Boston bomber, but a range of topics from climate change to financial instability and security, the future of our education system, healthcare system, you name it, pick a cause that you care and passionate about. The challenges that our institutions face are tremendous. And at the same time, people's trust in those institutions is declining markedly. It is not good. It is just, we are suffering from what many people describe as a governance deficit. I can scroll through a bunch of stats about the ways people feel about government. It's the lowest that it's ever been since we've measured these numbers. And it's not just the case in America that people don't trust our traditional institutions, as we know, but it's also the case around the world, which what causes us to be so interested in these new ways of working because of this declining rates of trust and the perception of the ineffectiveness of traditional centralized institutions. We tend to perceive this as a problem, though, of partisanship, and I will take issue at a later point with Henry in that I think that the focus on politics and on partisanship is misplaced, in the sense that if we fix this problem, it's still just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. We do not have institutions that are capable of making use of the work that all of you, that all of us are engaged in. We don't have the brain, which was the, I just wrote it down, the thing with the crowd and the brain and the Facebook and the top motor, whatever, any of this stuff. We don't have this for government, right? So you think people laughed at you 10 years ago? They're still laughing at me. Which is why I do this is maybe we should go to the same shrink in some way. But the question is, I think we're at the moment of a potential paradigm shift where we are beginning to embrace, thanks to the experiments and the work of you and of people in the room, and of the work especially that Karim has been doing in places like NASA, to begin to open up people's thinking to the idea that even in institutions of government and governance, the most staid and religious and hallowed halls of our democracy, we can do and decide differently. We can think about how to harness the power of the crowd to create smarter governance, to get better information into how we govern. But the question is, how do we do this, not from an individual perspective where we focus on what are the incentives for people to participate and how do they work together online, but from an institutional perspective. And that's where I and my research lab focus our work, is on the question of the epistemic properties of institutions. How do we create and how do we design institutions that can be smarter, that can make use of the crowd to make decisions and solve problems in new ways? What are the technological platforms? What are the social rules? What are the policies that we need? And in turn, what are the laws that we need to support that kind of a paradigm shift? So as we talk about the idea of getting more diverse participants engaged, you use the phrase think, collaborate, and contribute, fan machine it was called. The question is, how do we create fan machine for democracy? And I would argue that it's not just about creating institutions that are more participatory and therefore more legitimate, so the nice thing to do from a democratic perspective, but that is ultimately going to be empirically measurable, that's the hypothesis, as the right thing to do in terms of how we solve problems and how we create more effective institutions in the way that we work. So this is the backdrop for what I want to talk about today, which is a particular set of experiments, a particular attention to the ways in which democratic institutions are just beginning to be able to embrace the power of the crowd, small crowds, if you will, in the way that they work. I got my feet wet in this domain longer ago than this, but many people are familiar with, as you mentioned, the work that I've done on peer-to-patent, now back in 1995, if you can believe it, where we faced this challenge that the Patent Office had a stack of 1 million patent applications to examine, only a few hours in which to do it with, and no idea where to find the information that it needed to do so well. So we created a platform. It now seems almost quaint. We created a platform to allow them to help them find the informational needle in the haystack to help the Patent Office decision makers, the examiners, get better information into how that they work. The project actually has had an interesting and storied past, and it has a newly revived present thanks to changes in legislation and thanks to new attention by the White House to that topic. But what I want to focus on today is not that. It's the experiment that we're currently working on with the Food and Drug Administration, which is just beginning to think about the question of how do we tap the intelligence and expertise of the crowd, both inside the agency and outside of it, to improve the examination of medical devices. So the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, which is a division of the FDA, manages the very complex process of pre-market device approval. And devices can range from everything from a tongue depressor and a Band-Aid on the low end of complexity, which doesn't require the same level of regulatory review, to very dangerous devices like breast implants and hip implants that you hear about in the news that lead to illness and even death. And there are, in fact, thousands of deaths that are attributed to medical devices if they are improperly allowed to market. At the same time, a process that takes too long to review a device causes innovation to lag, causes people's jobs to suffer. We want to get these devices into market faster, both for economic reasons, but also to save lives. So the question of how to find that balance of being able to do something like examine a device or examine a drug or do the important functions of government, the regulatory oversight functions of government, could benefit tremendously from the ability to get in better information faster. The challenge is right now is that an agency like the FDA is facing an agility deficit. They only have 100 scientists who work in the relevant subdivision and 800 total in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, and they always need to get more expertise. There's also a lot of turnover in the division. They have an expertise deficit. So they have insufficient training for the staff that they have. They have extremely high ratios of frontline supervisors to employees, and they have an increasingly growing workload as a result of scientific and technological innovation. They also have a diversity deficit. So as the FDA explains, devices are based on technologies today that, quote, combine many different fields, such as materials science, electrical engineering, and fluid mechanics, making it hard often to find the people that they need. And increasingly, those devices are from wildly new areas than they've ever had to examine before. So whether it's nanoprinted, 3D printed materials, or something out of nanoscience, or even just an app, they don't have the Rolodex that allows them to get in the expertise that they need. But how do they get smarter today? How do they do this kind of work, which is like that work that so many government agencies have to do, where they need to get better information in to how they work? Well, the typical way that they do it is, you know what? They look to people from places like Harvard, right? Those fancy places where they think they're really smart. Well, a lot of you think you're really smart, and a lot of people think you are too, because you have these fancy pieces of paper. I have to say, I was not here yesterday because my son graduated from preschool, and he got his first certificate. It looks just like a Harvard diploma. It's printed in the same laser printer, I think. So we tend to view credentials as the way that we identify who knows what. And we view those credentials either internal to the agency, we're looking for the people that we know, or the people immediately outside who might have that knowledge. But in fact, as we've seen, this is not good enough to solve these kinds of problems. And it's not just more information that we need, right? It's not just about, we have plenty of information. And frankly, we have increasing amounts of data. I won't talk about big data and open data and the way that these are transforming how we govern. But we need expertise. We need to be able to sort different kinds of knowledge and know-how. We need people who are reliable and trustworthy, like those credentialed Harvard people. But we sometimes need people who have very specific know-how of a particular kind of device, for example, or who have very relevant information and know how to sort among large quantities of information. There were 1.4 million academic journal articles published last year. 1.4 million. We need people who know how to sort through the wheat from the chaff and to be able to advise about what we can actually rely on. This is your village idiot problem. We need to have very different kinds of expertise in order to make these kinds of decisions. So we look to the professionals now to do that, and that, frankly, is not wrong. It's not malevolent. It is not some evil, closed conspiracy of evil government, whatever. It's the lowest cost way to get at this kind of filtering mechanism that we have evolved over the last 150 years. And in fact, we have a legal basis to support it called the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which creates great constraints and strictures on how we're able to get in expertise from the outside. So now we're starting to experiment at the edges, thanks to the work of people like Kareem, where we're starting to think about how do we crowdsource wisely. So I had a hand, I'm very proud to say, in helping to articulate a policy which said we need to look to the American people and how to tap their intelligence and expertise. We need to go out and ask them for their ideas. But the problem is when we put out a general call, it's to an undifferentiated audience, and we don't know who's going to apply. We don't know how they're going to participate, and it doesn't really do much to match people's expertise to particular types of problems. The White House launched a platform that many of you know called We the People, modeled on what the Brits did called E the People, which essentially is a platform to allow people to create petitions to demand that the government do something, like build a Death Star or deport Justin Bieber back to Canada, the most popular one of all time. Have we done that yet? I'm not quite sure. And the problem is this does very little for people who have to make hard decisions like that of the FDA to do really difficult work. We have this wonderful platform called challenge.gov, which again allows us to put out a general call, and maybe we find, there are these wonderful stories of the person who was found, like your shot of the family of engineers and the, guy sitting under a rock somewhere whom you never would have found otherwise. But it's very hard to find that needle in the haystack. And that is, I would argue, the reason why we see so little institutional transformation, despite the work that has been proliferating over the last decade to do and then to study the work of crowdsourcing and the work of open innovation. The next step to get us from using open innovation as a practice of government and of governance requires that we do something more than the hit or miss practices of crowdsourcing, where maybe someone will show up and maybe they will not, and maybe it will solve a problem, and we don't know how to connect different kinds of crowdsourcing activities to different kinds of problems. What compounds this, of course, is the fact, and that's a longer story, that we have very, very little faith in the ability of people to solve hard problems in our political system. We tend to equate a lack of political literacy, so your knowledge of who Eric Cantor is equates to, now you don't have to know that anymore, so consider yourself, you've saved a brain cell. The fact that you don't have to know, the fact that knowing having political literacy, being able to name which branch of the government declares war or which congressman is which, tends to be how we measure what it means to be politically useful or knowledgeable or savvy, because we don't have institutions that recognize or have the ability to take stock of people's actual expertise in the sense of their skills and their experiences and their abilities. The internet, I would argue, is transforming how we actually make expertise searchable, which allows us, I think, in the next phase to begin to match people to problems, so that as we think about crowdsourcing, I think the next step in this equation, and this is the work the experiments that we're doing, and I'll come back to the FDA in a moment, is to think about how do we sort and find and match people 2 opportunities to participate so that we can think about segmenting the crowd. So you talked about the high level of computational expertise, the number of PhDs who are working on things like in the advertising space and in the commercial space. The question is whether we can sort of distract a few of their brain cells into the direction of thinking about how we govern. So, right, it's allowing us to proliferate all kinds of new markers of expertise and challenging what we actually think about as expertise, to go beyond credentials, to go beyond the Harvard diploma or the MIT diploma as the only way that we measure who knows what. So, right, so I can have credentials, I can have my LinkedIn profile that says how many diplomas I have, but I can also have other markers that show how many Coursera courses I completed, or how many TaskRabbits what I did, not just where I studied. I can show what my skills are now, how many commits I have to GitHub, or how many questions I answered on Stack Exchange. Or, as Panasi Pirotis at Stern has been working on, looking at the way that interests, in his work on quiz.us, he has looked at the way that interests actually create a manifestation of expertise. People who are more interested in a topic like medicine and health turn out to be much, much, much better at answering questions about health than are people, for example, with credentials or who are paid in a Mechanical Turk type of scenario. We can identify these kinds of expertise by scraping new kinds of data about people, as well as just by asking them about their expertise and getting them to self-report in new ways. But there really are an emerging multiplicity of techniques that are allowing us to shift from a world in which we think about expertise as only something that belongs to credentials to something that belongs to more of us, and where we can make it manifest and make it more searchable to people. So we're measuring also expertise in new ways, and there's lots of work that's been done around social recommender systems and around open innovation for a long time that's looked at these issues of how we measure expertise, which I think we can make use of for connecting people to problems. So sometimes we define expertise by how many endorsements somebody has or how many connections they have on a network. Or sometimes we define it by somebody's citations and their influence that they have, their citations. Sometimes we define it by the number of document views that somebody might have, the interest that's demonstrated by people in your work. Maybe we define it by the number of downloads, the engagement that we have with your work, as in SSRN, is different from academia.edu. Or maybe it's demonstrated success, how many challenges you've won, what kind of money you've garnered, how many questions you've answered, et cetera. So there's lots of ways, again, that we are defining expertise, that we are measuring it, and that we are making it searchable and visible in new ways. Peer-to-patent, the work we did around patents was the old model. You know, we designed it, we put it up, and we hoped people would find us. We made it very conducive to self-selection. What we cared about was that people, once they found it, would have a good experience and be able to collaborate and would have incentives to participate. But the challenge ended up being trying to market the project, helping that the right people with the right information would find it. What the FDA is now doing is something different. They are building off of the Harvard Profiles, the Harvard Catalyst Profiles platform, which is an expert network. They are loading in all of the population within the relevant divisions and then within NIH, within FDA and then within NIH, to make searchable their own personnel and to understand who has what kinds of expertise. So and that's the first phase. In the second phase, they will broaden this to the broader biomedical community outside of the FDA. So their goal is, by using this algorithmic locator system that builds on the Vivo expert networking system and its ontology for defining expertise and defining people's credentials. What they are doing is it's a very simple idea, simply making people's expertise searchable so that they can find people to advise on and then staff regulatory review panels. Their goal is to try to accelerate that process of finding people with the right expertise and matching them to the opportunity to participate. This, to me, is a really, really interesting an evolving experiment to look at trying to answer the question of if only we knew who knows what. And if we could think about then matching them to opportunities to participate. Knowing who knows what is in turn going to still have to reveal information about who participates well. Knowing who knows what, whether they're the highly credentialed Harvard diploma person, might mean they're a terrible participant, that they're less likely to engage, that they don't engage well, that they're badly behaved. Highly likely hypothesis there. Whereas the person who has evidence of various skills or evidence of certain interests that they've demonstrated in the medical field but has no credentials whatsoever may in fact be the better participant. So what we're doing with the FDA is to work out a set of research protocols to allow us to essentially run not just A/B but A-B-C-D tests that will allow us to compare what is the impact on staffing a regulatory review panel and the downstream impact on the quality of the review from using Harvard profiles versus not using it, from tweaking the algorithm within Harvard profiles for the kind of expertise that it waits for, from comparing the use of this system to other kinds of expertise finding systems, of which there are many, that will allow us again to test whether targeting expertise, whether matching, segmenting the audience, if you will, and trying to match it to a problem to solve, not to a product to buy, but to a problem to solve, can actually help us to increase the value of a crowdsourcing project, and in turn allow us to find more diverse kinds of expertise. It's not the end of the conversation, because matching is one part of it. We still have to ask what are the incentives that get people to participate well, and in what kinds of circumstances they're going to engage better, what sorts of problems lend themselves well to this kind of work. But I think this work, and particularly this kind of experimentation, is very, very important. And that's the note I want to end on, is that what's crucial here and what's really different is not only that we're testing a hypothesis around targeting and the use of expert networking to improve the value of crowdsourcing, but that we are introducing controlled trials and experimentation before the initiative rolls out, which is really unheard of and unusual within government circles. There has been some movement today to do experiments between the choice of policies. Should we have prostitution in Nevada but not have it in Massachusetts, and what's the result? But there has been almost no experimentation in how we make policy, in how we decide, in how we solve problems. And I think it is overdue for us to begin to introduce these kinds of experiments that we're doing often in the lab, in the field, into the work of real-world democratic institutions. Because it's only with that kind of experimentation that we are going to be able to create the evidence base to transform how our institutions work, to move from what is today a closed model of government behind closed doors to an open or open source or an open innovation model of government where our institutions work differently and hopefully work better. Thank you.